being here, and thank you to all the folks that have made it possible for us to be with you for 4 sessions. It's really lovely to have an ongoing kind of series and getting to see some familiar people from week to week to week. I'm here with Emil again, who is going to be my back end of things. They get to do more exciting things other than just paste in links. So just, letting folks know that this is not their only job. They have lots of smarts that you'll all get to see that eventually. So thank you for being here too. So we're going to talk today about identity-based hate violence and how the legislative world right now and our cultural kind of atmosphere is really changing the lives of trans and queer folks, as well as those of us who work with the community. Our agenda is really pretty simple. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about the truth mattering, and then we'll talk for the biggest chunk of the time about state-sanctioned hate and what that means, some of the examples of what that looks like, the impact of hate on communities' lives and on providers' lives, how people are coping, mostly how trans and queer folks are coping. We'll look a little bit at resilience, which I know can be a charged word, especially when we're talking about hate-motivated violence of people really shouldn't be resilient against that, but some of those positives of what people are doing in response to that violence. And then we'll end with what we can do. So as most of you know by now, I'm Michael Munson, Forge's executive director. I'm going to be really quick with this because most of you have already, the deal. Forge has been around for 29 years. We just kind of marked this. So maybe we've upped it a year between last time and this time, since June is our kind of anniversary. We're a trans anti-violence organization that has mostly focused on sexual assault, intimate partner violence, but is now looking a lot more at some other intersecting crimes like hate crimes and bullying and some of those other things that are really hard and happen to people. Our 2 guiding principles are about being trauma-informed and about being empowerment-based, all of which is kind of underscored by this culturally responsive lens of how do we do both of those things, be mindful of both of those things through that culturally responsive, vision, lens, approach. So hopefully today will not be traumatic. Hopefully it will not be disempowering. I will say though that today's content, I think, is more traumatic feeling than some of the trainings that we do. So I just kind of want to put that out there in the front that we can try to be trauma informed about it, but when we're dealing with really traumatic materials, sometimes that's hard to do. So please, please, please take care of yourselves. You heard the little recording button. Do whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. I used to always talk about people like going under their desk and hiding, but now that has kind of a different meaning with so many active shooter drills happening. So maybe people don't go under their desks, but please go where you need to go, take a break, have some water, stretch your body, do what it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. So a few little pieces of housekeeping. We're going to use poll everywhere again. So you all have been really fantastic at figuring out that whole little texting with your thumb things or using your web browser to add content. So hopefully we will not have any glitches this time. And I know you all are really adept at doing that. The other way that we'll interact is through chat. So we're all really familiar with that these days after we've been on Zoom for 3 or 4 years. So those are the 2 ways that we're going to interact today. So I wanted to start us out with just kind of framing some issues, and I will preface this with, I probably will be talking more today than some workshops where we're having a lot more interaction. So a couple of weeks ago, we really had a lot of interaction, and today might be a little bit more didactic, and hopefully that will allow you to process information as well as not feel pressured to interact if it's sensitive and hard to interact. So let's start with the truth matters. We are living in a George Santos world where people are denying things like climate change, where counting ballots is somehow meaning that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, where people believe that they can say or do anything regardless of whether it's true or if it hurts anybody, where people are denying science because it's either convenient or doesn't align with their beliefs that they want to hang on to, where there are caveats to everything in order to maintain a specific untrue belief. For example, caveats around whose life matters, about what it is to be pro-family, to whose identity is valid, to what rights a person has or should have, to what books are safe for kids, to caveats being around who can make the decisions about their own bodies, about who's able to make medical choices for themselves or about their kids or other members of their family, about who's able to access basic benefits that allow for a survivable existence. And we have some of that going on right now in the House and Congress. There are caveats about religion and lots and lots and lots of things. So for those who maintain that those untrue truths are true, these can be really caveat-driven belief sets. Hopefully my mouth will start working a little bit better as we move along. So the truth does matter, and sometimes the truth is complicated by people that believe different truths than the majority of us do. And right now, being alive in this culture, in our current world, can be really exciting or scary or joyful or anxiety-filled or connecting or isolating or lots and lots of things. It can be full of love or it can be full of hate. And right now, a lot of folks are really scared. A lot of folks are feeling all of those emotions, and underlying a lot of it is people are feeling afraid, afraid of what it's like to be in the world, nervous about what it's like going out and about, feeling a lot of doubt or reactiveness or isolation, or any of those things based on what it's like to be in this world and not have access to all the things that people as humans should have access to. And people are really tired. I love this photo. It's from a couple of years ago, many years ago, actually, of this young trans non-binary person who's hanging on to their cat's paw. And it's just such a capture of how tired sometimes people feel, and their glasses are off, and it's just, let's flop down on our bed because the world is just exhausting. So a lot of times we aren't knowing what shoe's gonna drop next.
Webinar from
So I wanted to start us off with a little bit of a story. And I don't tell stories very often, and so you'll have to humor me about my not very good storytelling. But this is a story that came a few years ago. So prior to COVID, I used to eat breakfast every morning at this lovely little Jewish deli on the way to my office. Now I don't go to the office and I don't eat out. So it was a lovely time where I got to eat with the same wait person who always brought me a Diet Coke. No judging on the Diet Coke part. But she was my point of human contact every day. I didn't oftentimes see a lot of people, but she was the one that I had a lot of contact with. And I would love just eating my breakfast, doing my today's, to-do list for that day, going over the things that I needed to do, and sometimes eavesdropping on a little bit of what was going on around me. And there was one day that I noticed that there were several Harley motorcycles that were parked in the lot. So Milwaukee, where I live, is the headquarter of Harley. So it's not too unusual to see Harleys riding around, but it was unusual to see multiple bikes in the lot of this little deli. And there were three guys that came in, and they were dressed in typical Harley gear with leather jackets and jeans and boots. And they were talking, and I couldn't help but overhear their conversation. They had just been to a funeral of one of their riding partners. They were all really good friends, and they were really distraught about why their friend had killed himself. And they knew that their friend was trans, and that was never, ever an issue for them, for any of them. And it really never came up very much in conversations when they were, going riding together, having a beer together, just being with each other. Their friend had died by suicide just days before the North Carolina bill HB2 had passed in 2016. So again, quite a few years ago. But HB2 was kind of one of the beginning states and beginning laws that prevented trans folks from using bathrooms that aligned with their gender identity. So for their friend, for these bikers' friend, this friend was this young person that killed themselves, was worried that this was just the beginning, that HB2 was just the beginning of what was going to happen. And he didn't want to live through that. And he didn't know if he could live through that. He thought things would only get worse. And unfortunately, he was right. It has gotten worse. So since 2016, so HB2 was in 2016, and somebody was elected president in 2016, we have seen a steady increase in anti-trans and anti-LGBT laws, both in terms of what was proposed, what is being proposed, and what's been enacted. We've also seen things like executive orders under the prior administration that stripped trans and queer people of some basic rights under the Department of Education, under Title IX, under many other federal level governing bodies. So things are changing a lot, as many of us know who watch the news, who are paying attention to some of the stuff, who are allowing it to penetrate our consciousness. Things are changing quickly, and things are sometimes spontaneous, kind of surprising what is coming up for new legislative efforts and new cultural shifts. So even those of us who keep track of what's happening, I try to be one of those people. It's really, really, really hard to keep up with all of what's going on that's anti-LGBTQ within those legislative actions and the cultural harm that's happening. And I know that anything that we talk about today is going to be different tomorrow. So please recognize that this webinar is just this snapshot in time, and that there is new news that's happening every day that impacts trans and queer folks, both in positive ways and in negative ways. So what we share today is this snapshot. And we need to pay attention tomorrow and the next day and the next day to find out how this story unfolds. So I'm not going to use a lot of exact numbers today because those numbers are going to change tomorrow. So we're going to paint some pictures, we're going to tell some stories today, and hopefully that will get us to a place of deeper understanding as we move along. So a lot of intersecting realities of what's going on. And we've talked about this, the other three sections, about how different things all interact with each other. Emil, in addition to being a great entering of the links, is going to read some of the quotes today too. So some of these are just interspersed throughout to remind us of some hopefulness and to remind us of the reality that we're living in.
This is from Charlie A. Scott. I am Dine, I am queer, I am trans, I am all of these identities and more. I am well aware of how this world refuses to celebrate all of me and others like me. To love who I am is an act of resistance, an act of resilience, and an act of disruption. I am so much more, and so are you. To the youth with questions about themselves, it is a journey worth navigating and exploring as you come to know who you are, and a journey of becoming as you learn to celebrate and love all that is you. Be patient and kind to yourself. Please never forget how brilliant and how beautiful you are.
Thank you. So intersecting realities, we just saw a little bit of that in the quote. We do know that many different identities are being targeted, not just trans folks, not just queer folks, and we're seeing this every day. We know that the intersections of identities can create a really compounded effect where there are disproportionate levels of violence that are occurring. And sometimes it makes it nearly impossible for us to figure out which identity someone is being targeted for. Sometimes there's like a whole bunch of things that are getting thrown at a population, and it's hard to pull that apart. We know that oftentimes when there are rollbacks or legislative actions that are intended to harm or limit one identity or one experience, that there's oftentimes a profound effect on other people's identities or experiences that don't share that intended audience for that targeting. One of the examples has been about the Dobbs decision and how many people are rightly concerned that this was the beginning of a big road that could lead to things like the reversal of marriage equality or some of the other things that are about autonomy and decisions that people make for themselves. And there are thousands of these intersections that can compound our pain and our ability to access life-affirming services. So our identities and our experiences can't be separated or divided. We all know that. Our rights can't be determined by one of our identities, but then denied by one of our other identities. So we all go together as part of a whole, and we all know that here today. So one of the things that we've continued to try to find is what are the higher rates of violence that are happening since some of this legislative and current environment have been emerging and have continued. And the reality is we don't really know. We'll probably know in 5 or 10 years from now when we see some of the reports, when we see some of that trending. But we do know pretty certain that there are more and more instances of sexual assault and intimate partner violence, hate-motivated crimes that are verbal and physical and property-oriented that are happening every day. The longer this hate-motivated trend is continuing, the more we're seeing victimization happen across our communities. I think I shared this slide with you before, and this is a little bit old now, but when we look at hate-motivated crimes, we know that LGBT folks are about 9 times more likely to experience hate crimes than non-LGBT people. Again, this is a number that's fixed in time. It's kind of meaningless. It's happening a lot. It's happening to a lot of people. We know things too in terms of the intersecting identities that the Department of Justice has acknowledged things like anti-LGBT hate as a threat, as well as anti-Semitism and anti-lots of other populations. It's pretty profound though when the DOJ does say, hey, this is a real issue. We're paying attention to this issue. We know that your community is a target, is at risk right now. We're also seeing things like what's happened in the last, I believe it's the last week with NAACP offering or encouraging a travel advisory for both folks of color, Black folks in particular, as well as LGBTQ folks to avoid traveling to Florida. And I'm really sorry that one of our staff people is in Florida and is living in that environment, which is really difficult right now. But what does it mean when an organization or the government says this state is not safe for people of color to go to, for people who are trans or queer to go to? And this really reminded me, as I was thinking about today and pulling this content in for today, of the green books that used to happen years and years ago, decades ago, where people of color would have little green books of knowing what places it was safe to stay at, like in terms of hotels or lodging or cities. And the same is true now. So not just the NAACP, but we know that trans folks are creating safe bathroom sites where people can figure out where it's safe to pee, in which states, in which like university buildings and whatever else it is. So we know that this is happening in the underground as well as now more publicly and overtly. So I wanted to share the story about Anna London, Lady London, and I'm going to share this in 2 parts. So the first part now, and we'll circle back around to her story later. So the photo that's on the screen is of Lady London at a memorial service back in March of 2023. And so we know that trans people every day are faced with slurs and threats and physical interactions and violence. We know that, we get that, we work in this world. In the past year in Milwaukee, again, my hometown, there were 4 Black trans women who were murdered. So that's a profoundly high number for one city, and it was a shock for us over the last year. At a vigil for Cachet Henderson in March, Lady London, an out Black trans woman, spoke at a rally following Cachet's death. Let me share with you a little bit about who Anna is, and we'll talk more about that vigil and that rally a little bit later in our time. So Anna, like her sisters who died, Anna has had a life full of violence from a very young age. Like her sisters, she experienced bullying in her childhood. Like her sisters, she didn't always have secure housing or access to food. Like her sisters, she didn't always have a steady or traditional type of employment, so has frequently worked in the sex trade to provide for her basic needs. Like her sisters, she witnessed violence in her neighborhood, in her friend circles, and within her family. Like her sisters, she experienced several relationships where there was intimate partner violence. Like her sisters, she has also been stabbed and shot multiple times. Like her sisters, she had extended her mutual aid. That's probably not the correct word, but she extended mutual aid to people in her community. And those people in her community that she welcomed into her home resulted in her having broken bones because of their violence against her. Like her sisters, when law enforcement was called because she was in danger, they were not there to help her. So I'll share more about Lady London as we move through today. So let's look at state-sanctioned hate a little bit more. So right now in our country, I think a lot of us are paying attention to these kind of three circles, if not more than these three circles. So one is the kind of anti-trans, also LGBT, but a lot of our legislative actions right now are focusing on anti-trans bills and actions. We're also having that circle around reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. And then gun violence is that third section of what we're looking at. And all of these things go together. All of these things intersect. So when we think about, well, why should we care about this stuff? Why should sexual assault centers care about it? Why should those of us who work in IPV care about it? Why should it matter? It should matter because it's important. It should matter because these things are intersecting. They relate to sexual violence. They relate to partner abuse. There are threats that limit access to healthcare. People who are assaulted oftentimes need healthcare. There are overt threats to personal and systemic safety. How do people stay safe following or before sexual assault or sexual violence? And right now we're seeing that a lot of people feel really emboldened to take action and act really violently. So part of what I think is happening with increases in sexual assault is people are feeling more emboldened to take those actions. And I'm sorry I didn't put a date on this. I believe this is a 2023 poll, and it was done by NBC News. And this is really shocking about kind of the pulse of the nation. So they asked folks kind of like, what do you think is okay with trans folks? Have we gone too far in accepting trans people, or have we not gone far enough? And you can see that those numbers are pretty equal in terms of, have we gone too far? It's the majority of people think that, or the plurality of people at least, that think that we have gone too far in accepting trans people. What does that mean for trans people and queer people living in our world?
Every act of care you give yourself is an act of resistance. Every day you survive is an act of resistance. The barriers you face are real and often imposed knowingly by the ruling class. Defy them by continuing to exist and continuing to live authentically. Find joy in even the smallest things. And that's from Harper Rainflower Sullivan.
Thank you. And some of these images and some of these quotes that you're seeing, we have posted on social media throughout Mental Health Awareness Month, which is May. So we encourage you to go back through some of our social media posts. And there are a lot of links to mental health and survivorship related topics, some links to our blog, as well as some really cool quotes like these. So let's look more deeply at what state-sanctioned hate is. And Emil, I'm wondering if you could read these out again. State-sanctioned hate is.
Yeah, state-sanctioned hate is hate-driven behaviors, bias, or crimes that are perpetuated by legislation, political or cultural movements, law enforcement, or media. It is systemic and institutionalized harm based on a foundation of hate intended to erase or degrade a group of people with a shared identity or experience.
Thank you. So that's a little bit academic-y, but we get what this means. So, and I've probably flipped back and forth between perpetrating and perpetuating. So it's kind of the same deal in this, in our discussion today. But when we think about like, who is doing this? Who is taking the actions that we're seeing every day? There are a bunch of people that are taking these actions. So we've seen really publicly that the politicians, the legislators are making a lot of actions that are anti-trans and anti-queer. Those get out in public really easily. We're seeing some celebrities or people that have visible power also coming to the forefront and both supporting trans and queer people, but also acting out against trans and queer people. We know on a smaller level, on kind of the meso level at school districts, at community levels, that schools and school boards and parents are taking actions that are anti-trans and anti-queer. We know that health clinics are also engaging in behaviors that limit access to folks. And sometimes it's the healthcare clinics themselves that are limiting access. And sometimes it's from that top-down structure that we'll talk about in a little bit about how the legislation is impacting those health clinics. We know that law enforcement are not always there to protect people, but are sometimes, unfortunately, there to cause additional harm to some populations. And we know that some religious institutions and folks of religious beliefs are perpetuating some of that harm. I wanted to share with you another story. So we've got Anna, Lady London, and we've got Christina. And these are two stories that we're going to bring through today. And Christina is an out trans woman who had experienced a lot of Christian-based anti-transness in her growing up and through her early adulthood. And she has a really cool TikTok, for those of you who are on TikTok, that Emil's just dropped into the chat, called Transplanter. So this is a video about some of how these segments of Christianity have caused harm to a lot of different people. And again, Christina has experienced a lot of this harm directly, and her TikTok channel is really devoted to what she calls Christo-fascist beliefs. So again, this is just one segment of how hate is coming forward. Not the only way, and certainly not all Christians feel and believe this way. So let's listen to this short video, and we'll talk about her more a little bit.
The thing that I wish people would realize about Christo-fascists is they're not going to stop with the trans people. They're not going to stop with the trans kids. They won't stop with the drag queens or the gay people. They're not going to stop with reproductive rights. They're not going to stop with the Jews or the Muslims or the immigrants. They're not going to stop with the United States. They're not going to be happy until they have world domination. It's not that these people don't believe in climate change. It's that they believe that the world isn't burning fast enough. Because it's not until all hope is lost that their Messiah will be inclined to return and swoop them up to leave the rest of us for dead. Make no mistake, the destruction of everything is what these people are after. No one is safe, and if you think you are, you need to get your head out of the sand.
So again, one person's experience, one person's framing of the world, but she's not alone in some of those beliefs and seeing that intersection of what's going on. So let's look at who's being targeted. So some of us might think, well, we know who we're talking about here, but let's talk a little bit about who's affected by anti-trans or anti-queer hate violence. And you'll notice that I'm talking a lot more about trans folks than queer folks. Please know that you can extend some of this to queer folks, but right now in our world, trans folks are really getting the majority of the harm that's happening in our world. So when we look at who's affected, trans and non-binary folks themselves are affected. The families of trans and non-binary folks are affected. The friends and allies of friends and family, the friends and allies of trans and non-binary people are affected. We also know that doctors and therapists and service providers, and that can include some of you, are also affected by anti-trans and anti-queer hate. We know that the politicians and legislators are not just doling out hate, but they're also at the receiving end of that hate as well. We know that school systems, again, they might be creating anti-trans or anti-queer policies, but they're also at the receiving end of those things as well. We know that religious institutions are also receiving as well as dishing out, and some businesses are deeply affected by the anti-trans and anti-queer hate that's going on. So let's look a little bit about the modes of how this is playing out. So just a few of the state-sanctioned, hate modes are the legislative or the criminalization pieces. So that's the stuff that we see a lot. We see things like policies that are showing up in school districts, in places of work, things that don't make it to a legislated level, but they still have enforcement abilities. We're seeing things show up on social media a lot, depending on where we look with things. We're seeing it on mainstream news, again, both positive and negative, depending on what news you consume. For folks who are on the dark web, which sounds really scary, and it probably is scary, there is a lot of anti-trans and anti-queer things that are going on in those spaces. And for what I mean by dark web, I'm talking about things like 4chan or 8chan, Discord, Stormfront, Telegram, some of those private channels, as well as different platforms of social media that folks are hanging out on. We know that hate violence is happening in in-person rallies and at protests, and through things like doxing, and that could be integrated throughout all of those things. So doxing is that publicly exposing of someone through their, putting out their name or their address or other identifying information about them, intending to cause harm to them. So we know that there are several different areas that anti-trans, anti-queer violence is happening. So we're going to look at a couple of these and just give you like one or two examples of each of these. Look at social media and how it's being spread really quickly and kind of capturing all of these other things through social media. Access to healthcare, threats against providers, child abuse claims, transition bans or detransition bans, what's happening at schools with book bans and other things at schools, what's happening around bathrooms still, what's happening around sports, what's happening in people's workplace, what's happening in terms of what politicians are doing and spending their money on, how politicians are behaving badly when they're not creating anti-trans or anti-queer laws, and how places that do drag are being affected as well. Those are the pretty pictures that go with each of those categories, which I was going to try to do as little slide-ins, but hey, you got the words and the images. So let's look at social media first. And I just wanted to pick one example because it's hard to figure out what examples to pick. So we did Trans Day Visibility posts all through March, and we had a lot of anti-trans slurs and hates in the comments that we had to delete. And so, just a reminder that even when there's positive stuff going out about trans affirming things, we can all get slammed for those things. And that's not meant to deter us from posting positive things, but groomer is one of those words that is getting thrown around a lot as a negative slur. And it's untrue, and it's really harmful for both people in the community as well as that public messaging. A lot of states are engaging in healthcare restrictions. And so this image, which I'm not expecting people to read, is what is happening in Missouri as an emergency rule, a signed decree that banned most gender-affirming care for trans adults in that state. So more features of Missouri's Attorney General's rules were that there are increased gender identity, gender dysphoria must be documented for at least 3 most recent consecutive years, have resolved any existing mental health comorbidities, checked for social media addiction in minors, and ensure at least annually that the patient is not experiencing social contagion with respect to the patient's gender identity. Clinics must retroactively adhere to all of those regulations, including the folks that are grandfathered in, grandparented in. So trans adults are officially being pulled off of their medications in Missouri and are being forced to detransition. A new ban targeting trans care statewide is one of the cruelest in the country. And that was in April of this year. And we're seeing more and more states doing that as well. So this happened to be a screenshot of a provider who sent out notes to all of his trans clients saying, I can't refill your prescriptions. Basically, let's figure out what we can do with this, but I'm locked down. I can't do this. I can't serve you. We know that some of these bills, some of these medical bills are forcing people to detransition. Some of the other things that are happening in our country are forcing people to go back and live out their in their assigned sex assigned at birth. So we can look at things like Alabama or Arkansas or Virginia or Tennessee or Montana or Oklahoma. There are many, many, many states, and a growing number of them, that are basically telling kids you need to go back to this very painful place that you used to be in prior to some of the social transitions that you had made. there are places that are still doing things around bathrooms. So Kentucky is an interesting state. And I know it's not your state, but there's some interesting things are happening. And I'm sharing other states because we never know when these things are going to come to our state, whatever state that is. So Kentucky is full of a lot of anti-trans legislation. Some of it's failed and some of it's passed. And some of it has included things like medically detransitioning all trans teens, like we just talked about. And another was about banning trans people from playing sports on teams that aligned with their gender identity. The newer bill that was introduced in early 2023 calls transgender students in bathrooms an emergency. So it's an emergency that trans people are using bathrooms. It's not, because trans people have been doing this for a long time. But the governor indicates that it poses a significant disruption in school activities. And it's unsafe when trans students use the facility that aligns with their gender identity. So under this bill, it requires trans kids to use bathrooms that are associated with their sex assigned at birth, or to out themselves to request an accommodation. It also gives non-trans people 2 years to sue people if they discover that that person used a locker room or bathroom with a trans person. So 2 years, somebody can sue because they used a locker room or bathroom with a trans person. That's pretty profound. We know that many states are also doing these sports bans and not allowing trans girls in particular to play on girls' sports teams. Some states, like Ohio, which has gone back and forth in its legislation on if it's valid or not, are proposing genital checks. So you can play on the girls' team if we make you undress and show us your genitals to prove that you're a girl like the other non-trans girls. So this is happening in a couple of states, and there are other similar processes that are going on across the country. This was a really interesting thing about folks at work. So there have been a lot of legislative actions around schools and about teachers, being forced to use the names and pronouns of students that they don't use, that the student doesn't use. But there was a law that came out in North Carolina that was really interesting, that talked about the DNA of pronouns and a DNA pronoun mandate. And some of us might be going like, what the heck are DNA-based pronouns, right? That they don't exist, right? We don't do pronouns based on DNA. Pronouns are language, they're words, they're identities, and identity ways to describe our identity and classify who we are. But this bill would mandate that all employers in the state, so again, we're talking about North Dakota, it would mandate that all employers in the state who receive state funds, as well as all schools, institutions, state agencies, and offices, that all of those things misgender trans people at large, not just students, but all trans people. The bill also mandates that words used to reference an individual's sex, gender, gender identity, or gender expression mean the individual's determined sex at birth, male or female, only giving people 2 options. It also mandates that this be determined through an individual's DNA, their DNA. So those who violate this will be charged by the state a fee of $1,500. So of course, most people don't know what their DNA is. Most people don't know if they have an XX or XY on their chromosomes. And how are people who are accusing other people of using certain pronouns supposed to know what the person's DNA is? So this is just like a big cluster of things. But again, we're linking these things of uninformed people making legislative action that really harm basically everybody. We saw in the 2022 election cycle that Republicans spent $50 million on anti-trans ads. They had flyers and ads that came out in at least 25 states. We really don't know what's going to happen because this is continuing to grow and expand. What's going to happen leading up to 2024's election? How much money and energy is going to be spent on anti-trans initiatives to try to get people into office? So this photo dates back to 2021, so a few years ago, but this was in the debates around the passing of the Equality Act. So Illinois Representative Marie Newman has a trans kid, trans daughter, and like several of her colleagues, she hung a trans pride outside of her office. And across the hall from her is Georgia's Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. So they were having these dueling office fights in their hallway. And Marjorie Taylor Greene posted a sign that says, there are only two genders, male and female, trust the science. So this is happening kind of in that interpersonal dynamics within legislators, as well as through their legislative actions. We know too that people are calling trans folks and queer folks things that just are not true. So again, our person, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was calling trans athletes trans terrorists. I think many of us know that she goes off on rants about a lot of things. And again, I'm not being partisan of who's doing what, but trans folks are generally not terrorists. And she's relating that to sports and trans athletes. And we have more and more politicians behaving badly across the country. So on the state level, on the federal level, on the local level, this images of an Arkansas senator asking a trans woman if she had a penis. And, you know, trans folks know that this is a really common question, but we would hope that it would not happen in a legislative body or anywhere. This is an interesting thing that continues to be kind of scary for a lot of folks. When the Proud Boys were really targeting drag events, drag story hours, this website emerged to report a drag event. And so we think that it's going to Proud Boys. We don't know, we collectively don't know where it's going to, but people in communities can go to this website and type in where they know to be a drag event happening, or a queer event happening, or a trans event happening. And supposedly somebody will then show up at this event and cause problems. We don't really know how much of this is actually happening in real life, but it's just fascinating and really, really scary that there's a website that is trying to collect where trans, queer, and drag events are happening with the intention of possibly targeting those events. So again, all of this, as we kind of wrap up the really heavy, really uncomfortable pieces of anti-trans and anti-queer legislation, is that there's just widespread violence that's happening. There's a criminalization of gender and affirming care and queerness, and that really creates a lot of pervasive fear in communities, both within trans and queer communities and within the broader communities at large. Okay. So before we switch to Bud Light, which could be a happy subject for some or an unhappy subject for some, I encourage us to take a breath if that is something that helps you feel better, or don't breathe if that helps you feel better. Stretch if you need to stretch. I will potentially model that. Thank you, Kelsey, for modeling as well. Okay. So for folks who are on social media, folks who watch TV or streaming services, you've probably heard about Bud Light partnering with Dylan Mulvaney, who is a TikTok influencer, an out trans woman. And some of the stuff that happened with the Bud Light commercials really kind of exploded or imploded. I want to show you two videos. So both show how anti-trans and anti-queer hate can and does impact people of all sexual orientations and gender identities, and it doesn't just hurt queer folks. So this first video needs a little bit of a content warning. Many of you have seen it. It's of Kid Rock, who directly following the ads that came out, ended up doing things like blasting with a gun a bunch of Bud Light cans. So that is the verbal warning of what's going to happen. It's a clip that shows a couple of other things as well. There's no human being harmed, but it's an intense video. So let me share this video and we'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards.
Today, Bud Light facing some backlash over its partnership with a trans influencer. Take a look. There's a video posted by Kid Rock that has more than 1 million views, hundreds of comments praising him for shooting at cases of Bud Light. Other videos posted online show people like dumping their Bud Light into trash bins and down sinks, even destroying cans of the beer. Why? Well, Bud Light had teamed up with trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney during the NCAA's March Madness college basketball tournament. And while March Madness has officially wrapped up by now, it seems like the response to this partnership just seems to be getting more and more intense. Jay Valle, who's been following this story, is here with us now. Explain this. Explain the timeline here.
Well, after Dylan posted that, Hallie, thank you for having me, first of all. But, you know, after Dylan posted this video, I mean, a lot of backlash came mostly from conservatives. And then when you have those individuals and with larger platforms like Kid Rock, you can imagine the conversation ignited even more. But Dylan Mulvaney is no stranger to the backlash from conservatives who, you know, as she has 10 million followers on TikTok, and she's a trans woman who has documented her experience for over a year now. You know, I assume now that Dylan received backlash on a daily basis, so she did not respond to our request for comment.
What are we hearing from Bud Light on this?
Yeah, Bud Light, I mean, the last 48 hours, as these videos have thousands of views, they did not ignore what conversations were being sparked, and Bud Light sent a statement, actually. Anheuser-Busch works with hundreds of influencers across their brands, and as many ways to authentically connect with their audiences across various demographics is to partner with these influencers. So, I mean, as of this point, I mean, these videos, again, continuing to flow in, and that backlash is pretty intense there, as, you know, that Kid Rock video has over 1 million views now.
Jay Valle, thank you very much for that
Thank
breakdown.
you.
We'll read more about it, I know, in your postings for NBCnews.com. Your stories there. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Today, Bud.
So intense video of a lot of feelings by people that got upset about probably a 30-second Bud Light video that had a trans woman in it. We're seeing other kinds of things happening, like Target, who's always been pro-queer, pro-trans. And I think many of us know that there's been some backlash against Target for having rainbow-colored, like, kids' clothes and adults' clothes and flags and things like that in their stores. And we're not going to go into the politics of what it means that Bud Light pulled back or that Target may be needing to remove some of those things from their stores. People need to do what they need to do. Target, for example, needs to make sure that their employees are as safe as they can be. And when there's violence that's happening, physical violence that's happening in their stores, they might need to remove some of those things that are causing that physical violence. So again, we're going to kind of set aside what the reactions are of those companies, but we see this coming into everyday life with big companies, little companies in our communities locally. So let's look next at the impact on trans and queer communities. You know, I think it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of overwhelming fear that queer and trans folks are having. There's restricted access to services, all kinds of services. There's a feeling of lack of access to places like sexual assault centers, even though that's not necessarily what is happening, but there's a belief that it's happening. There's a lot of things around family and other interpersonal tensions. So there's the impact is really, you know, widespread. What I'd love folks to do next is to engage with Poll Everywhere. So get out your phones, get out your laptops or whatever you have to go to a web browser. And the question is, what are some of the impacts of the current legislative and cultural attitudes, behaviors, all of those things that are going on queer and trans people? So what do you think some of the impacts are for queer and trans folks? And hopefully this will work this time. I know one of the times we had things coming up as a word cloud, not as a stream. So what are some of those impacts? Higher rates of depression, yes. Fear. Intense fear. Reminder that folks can type in the chat if you can't get to the Poll Everywhere. Fear of travel, death. More fear to go out in public, right? Negative physical health impacts from stress, feeling and or actually being less safe in public space, unable to come out. Isolation, right? Hatred towards trans and queer folks, yeah. feeling like trans and queer folks are invalid, physical violence, dehumanization of trans people, missing school, exactly. Lower self-esteem due to shame, potential physical harm, no access to housing, right? Hopelessness, exhaustion, forcing to change their gender expression to feel safer in society. Regression into past trauma responses, excellent, feeling targeted, forced detransition. False claims made towards them, for example, wanting to cause harm to children, right? Fear or lack of desire to start families, further strain on relationships and families, inability to seek medical care, right? Loss of family or social support, feeling forced to do things because they could be outed, feeling defeated, bullying, feeling like they have to leave everything they know, their hometown, their family, feeling unsafe, potentially everywhere, right? Amazing list. Unable to find or keep employment. Feelings of hopelessness, Really powerful list. Really, really powerful. Thank you for coming up with so many of the things that are so true for folks. Lack of community in rural areas, right? All of those things. All of those things. Thank you for adding to that list. I'm not going to add more to that list. That list is great. Not great for a positive reason, but it's a great list of really thinking through what is happening, what's the impact on folks. Let's shift and talk about how people are coping. So we've got the impact. We know these things are really having a profound impact on people, where they go, how they feel, what they can access. Let's look at how folks can cope. So I know that I've shared with you before that we know that some of the basic coping strategies are around alcohol and drugs, around isolation, around kind of this hierarchy of who's most oppressed and kind of infighting within communities. We know that some trans communities are stockpiling hormones because of fear of not being able to access. We have some of these just kind of generalized things that are happening across communities. We're also having folks move out of state. We're having adults who don't feel safe in their state. We have adults who have trans or queer kids who are like, we got to get out of here. We got to get to a safer space. And a lot of folks are thinking, where is a state that's safer? Is it going to be safe for the long run? So we have a lot of folks that are considering moving, that are moving, that are afraid of where they're living right now. We know that a lot of folks, like some folks have mentioned in that brainstorm, are worried about job loss. They're worried about their kids being taken from them. We see this happening with some of the ways that legislation is being introduced, some of the caveats to those legislative pieces that indicate that there's a threat to parents, there's a threat to workers, there's a threat to housing, there's a threat. If this, then you're going to lose this other thing that's important to you. We also know that there's a dramatic increase in security and safety measures that are happening around queer and trans events. This was mostly happening for a while around drag events, because that was really kind of the heart of what was becoming visible, and kind of that social media visible and TV visible. And now we're seeing that increased security is happening at other trans and queer-based events. It'll be interesting to see this summer, as we enter into Pride Month, what's going to happen in communities across the country about increased security, or if there's actually going to be increases in protesters or violence at Pride events. We don't know. It's going to be an interesting, I don't want to call it an experiment, but it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. And hopefully people will not be harmed in this next month or in any time. We know too that trans people in particular, probably queer people as well, but we know for sure that trans people are increasing their gun ownership. A lot of that has been because trans folks are not thinking that law enforcement will protect them, that their neighbors will protect them. And hey, I got to protect myself, so I'm going to get a weapon. And, you know, I've said this a lot, and you probably have heard me say this in the last 3 sessions, but when there's a gun in the house and there's intimate partner violence or there's sexual assault, it can dramatically increase the fatality of those interactions that may not be fatal if there wasn't a gun involved. So again, we're seeing that more and more people in our country have access to guns. It's easier to get guns in almost every state. And there is that increase in ownership within trans and queer communities. One of the things that I saw very recently, this was from March of 2023, when there's been some movement around posting about trans joy, not just Forge, but a lot of organizations are posting about trans joy. And this person said that trans joy doesn't exist when lawmakers are trying to take away the very little rights we have. So there's some pushback of like, you know, hey, let's offer some positive things about trans joy. When people are saying, hey, you know, basically screw this. This is really tough right now. Everybody's against me. How can I possibly feel trans joy? So that's kind of how people are coping, is like, hey, I'm not going to go with that trans joy thing. I need to just put out there that this is not feeling good for me. All right, let's go back and talk about Anna, Lady London, and a little bit more about who she is. And then I'd like to play a video that shares a little bit more of her story. So again, promised we'd come back to her. She is one of the living survivors, as I mentioned, of 4 of her trans sisters that got killed in Milwaukee, both shot and stabbed. At a vigil for Cache Henderson back in March, Lady London spoke at a rally, and that's the part of the video that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. She has experienced a lot of things in her life. So in addition to those 4 friends that she lost in this past year, she has seen a lot of violence around her, and she hasn't known how to stay safe, where to stay safe, who to connect with to help her stay sane, to keep on going through the world. The community of Black trans women here in Milwaukee, as well as around the country, are also struggling with a lot of those same issues. And as we continue to learn more about anti-trans legislative actions and policies and this culture of trans hate that we're living in, Anna and her peers, both again here in Milwaukee and across the country, have been seriously exploring concepts of detransitioning. You all mentioned some of that in our brainstorm. So people are thinking and acting on detransitioning. And the primary questions for the folks that are considering this is, will I be safer if I transition back to the gender that I used to live in, the gender that I was assigned at birth? And so the question really becomes about which truth is more important for somebody, the truth of being safe or feeling safer, or the truth about their gender identity. So again, let me share with you this section of a speech that she gave at one of the outdoor rallies that was the pop-up the night after Cache Henderson was killed.
It's been 6 months since our brother Dedrick Cross was murdered and laid to rest. It's been 8 months since we laid our beautiful sister, Queen Regina Maya, to rest. And it's been 9 months since we laid Troy Davis to rest. And it's been about 9 months since we laid Brazil to rest. And it's been 3 years since we laid our sister Essence to rest, who was murdered in Atlanta while traveling. And now we're going to lay our sister Cache Henderson to rest. And as we do this, with these tragedies drawing closer to home and more expeditiously than I'm normally used to, it has caused alarming concern to face the hard truth that though I love who I am and I want to live authentically, that it's beginning to come down between my happiness or detransitioning, all because I feel that my safety is the priority. And as these thoughts flutter my mind, I can't help but to think about more truths. That even if I were to detransition, I still have to face the fact that I'm a brown body and I have a male anatomy. And that leads me towards my brother Dedrick Cross. And it lets me know I'm still not safe. You know, I'm still not safe. And though we can agree that there's no safe space for any one of us, man, woman, trans, cis, the probability of me being unsafe is way higher than any of you. And as I think about my own intersectional identity, and I think about Cachet and all the many stories and things that we share with each other, and how many similarities we had as far as traumas and things like that, I can't help but feel that if I don't change my own course, I can be next. And I don't want to be next. And like my sister Aaliyah said, I don't want to be on a picture that says RIP. I don't want to go before my time. And I'm so hurt because I spoke to this young lady the night or the morning that she was murdered. And she was so vibrant and happy. She was telling me about her birthday plans, telling me about photo shoots that she had planned coming up. She's trying to show me the photographer and everything. And I was just so happy because she was already going through trials. And I was like, look at her, she's still going. And I'm still going. And Elle's still going. And Aaliyah's still going. Mercedes is still going. My daughter Nalasia is still going. And we still going. But it's not easy. And it's getting harder, as we can see. Year after year, all around the world, in the country, they killing people like us. And for what? Because of discomfort and dislike. But there's a lot of things that I'm uncomfortable with. Like being murdered. But I'm not going around taking people's heads off for it. And as we gather here today, I hope that this can be the last one. I pray to God that this could be the last gathering that we have when it comes to our community. I hope that you find it in your hearts to encourage people to protect us and to love us and to care about us and understand that it's just different. Thank God that you're different. Thank God that you have your own identity. Thank God that we are all able to be individuals. And we need to encourage others to continue their individuality and to love each other. And maybe the thoughts of me detransitioning and going into an unhappy place in my life will go away. Because I don't want to. But I don't want to die at the hands of somebody else. I'd rather kill myself before I allow somebody out here to take me. To take me because of who I choose to be and who I choose to stand for. The people I choose to love. I'm going to stop now because I don't want to get emotional. I don't want to cry. I've been trying to keep my tears and composure together.
So that is really intense and really real. And she is not alone in those feelings. I think that Anna has a really beautiful way of expressing her truth. And I have a feeling that she will be someone who expresses her art more as time goes on. And I really, really sincerely hope that she can stay in this world because it's a really hard place for us to be, for her to be. And yeah. So I encourage us again, take a moment. If we need to move or stretch, Kelsey can stretch again with me. I only stretch one arm, so I should probably stretch the other arm. We can both, move it around. Okay. So we're talking about a lot of intense things today because the world really is intense. So let's look at this, what this means for sexual assault survivors, what it means for us as service providers. And Emil's going to start us off with a quote for this section.
Yeah. Those barriers are still very real. That happens all the time today. And I think my job is to help do some of that repair work, not to make up for what other therapists have done, but to say, how do we heal from that? How do you do that big, scary thing again? That is to trust someone with your story. And that's Travis Trott.
Thank you. So some of our jobs might be to hold that space, hold those hard realities of what's going on for folks. It may not be doing the work that we're typically used to as advocates, as providers around sexual assault, but we may have to do some of that repair work as well. And most of us are not trained to do that. And I really get that. And part of why I wanted to share some of these videos, some of these stories with you, as painful as they are to listen to. And I apologize for that, because I know that it's not always trans-informed to be, or trauma-informed to be so vivid about the stories. But sometimes we need to hear the stories in order to start thinking about what is the repair that needs to happen. How can we hold that space for repair within that one-on-one space, with our coworkers, with our communities geographically, and beyond. So when we look at what the impact is for sexual assault survivors, we know that people are anticipating that violence will happen, that sexual assault will happen, that intimate partner violence will happen, that bullying will happen, that hate-motivated crime will happen. We know that that's just kind of, people are just expecting and anticipating that it's going to happen. We know that not all agencies are trustworthy or places that people can trust. And a lot of trans and queer folks are like, hey, is this agency going to be okay for me? Is this person that's in front of me going to be okay and trustable? We know that there's some deeper concerns that are happening around law enforcement, as we see more and more stories of law enforcement behaving badly and prejudice. Emil, say the word for me. Sorry.
Prejudicially.
That big long word, behaving badly. Thank you though for saying the word. We also know that people have concerns around child protective services being called, their kids being taken away, what's going to happen to their life and their safety when somebody else, or if somebody else gets involved post-assault. We know that those are some of the concerns. That's just the tip of the iceberg. We know that there's a lot of concerns that are out there. One of the things that I wanted to share with folks today related to sexual assault nurse examiners and where a lot of those SANEs exist, where a lot of the forensic nursing exists. There was a report that came out in 2022 in December from the Movement Advancement Project, MAP. And it said that at least 24 different hospitals and providers across at least 21 states were directly targeted by coordinated online harassment campaigns. So we're a long ways away from 2022 in December, and more places have been targeted and required to shut down some of their trans-affirming care, but they're also shutting down other types of care within those facilities. In one of the places, and I'm blocking on which state it was, they're not allowing nurse practitioners to provide gender-affirming care. And you might think, like, what does that have to do with sexual assault care and forensic nurse examiners? Well, a lot of those nurses, a lot of those forensic nurses that are also primary care providers for trans and queer communities are leaving people's states. So there might be an exodus of physicians, of healthcare providers, of folks that can't practice in their state. So they're moving elsewhere where they can practice. So that could mean a shortage of SANEs in your community. I don't think it's happening in Connecticut because Connecticut's not one of those states, but it's something that we need to be aware of and what that might mean. So maybe Connecticut will get more forensic nurses because of people leaving other states, but that is just something for us to think about. What is the impact of nurse practitioners not being able to practice whatever it is the medicine is that they're practicing, whether it's primary care or forensic nursing? All right, so let's look at resilience. We've got about 20 minutes left. And like I mentioned in the beginning, resilience is one of those words that doesn't really fit in this context, because how can we be resilient around hate crimes and around hate violence? But I hope that you can get the gestalt of that word of, like, what are the public responses? What are the positive responses? What are the things that might give us a little bit of hope that we can see our way through this really challenging time? So I want to go back to the Bud Light commercial and Dylan Mulvaney. And there's a lot of backlash. The video clip from NBC said, like, I bet Dylan's getting a lot of hate violence. Well, yeah, there's a lot of hate response that Dylan received. And I want to share a short video that Dylan and Skylar Baylor did about what Dylan's responses have been, what she feels about what happened.
Dare I say, this might be, this is controversial,
Go for it.
but the people that are targeting us right now, I'm trying to find grace for them because I know that this was you know, planted from something else. And I can only hope that they will see the beauty and the humanity and the importance of an identity and not trying to strip that away, because don't think we're trying to take it away from them.
Grace is not space to violate my boundaries.
No.
Grace is not, hey, come be transphobic. Grace is, I understand that you have your own battles to fight and you're going to fight them over there. And I didn't get it at one point. You don't get it. How can we move forwards?
Grace is going to be my word of the week. I decided.
What do people think about that? Can we have some combo in the chat? You wanted me to replay it? What do people think about that response of Dylan Mulvaney offering grace to people who were shooting up beer cans and saying really, really vile things to her and to trans and queer communities? Any thoughts about that? Are you surprised by what she said? So I'm seeing that that's always on the victims. Oops. Always on the victims to be stronger. I like that she said Grace wasn't giving a pass. Exactly. The burden is always to be the bigger person. Must be exhausting. I think fighting back is what they want. It makes trans people seem violent. That's an interesting perception of that. Yeah. She's really mature and strong. Responding to hate with hate perpetuates the cycle. Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of exclamation points, which I don't know how to do. So yay for like people like upping some of those comments. Really great to see those little exclamation points. So I think that this captures so much of like, how do we respond to things? Not everybody wants to respond this way. Not everybody can respond this way. But it's interesting when somebody who has 10,000 TikTok followers is responding to something like from Kid Rock that had 1 million TikTok followers, and how do we respond? And so there's something to be learned, I think, for how we want to maybe take this in, even if it's not for us. So I'm seeing another comment that says, giving grace allows me to live without hate in my vessel and disturbing my own peace. Thank you for the comments. Emil, do we stick the link in there to Skylar's TikTok?
We didn't, but I will get it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Dare I?
So some of the other positives and resilience things that are coming out of what's happening is that there are a lot of affirming pharmacies and medical companies that are providing medical care online. We knew that through COVID that people were doing medical care online. Well, some of these trans affirming companies, I just kind of other them, but these trans affirming companies that are having a lot of physicians, nurse practitioners, probably some of those nurse practitioners that are getting kicked out of some of their states, are working for places like Plume, and there are many other companies that are really trans focused that are providing hormones for folks who want and need them under the supervision of a medical provider. So we're seeing that growth for people that can't access hormones in their own state or location. I know that I put a picture up of Lizzo in one of our times together in the last 3 weeks, but we've got people like Lizzo and a whole bunch of other musicians that are showing up on stage in drag. They're showing up with drag queens. They're showing up with big, huge pride flags. They are saying, we're not going to have this. We're just not going to put up with this stuff. And they're making a positive statement in response to what's happening. We see things like this. This was a little graphic that was all over social media a couple of months ago, but we're seeing a lot of people like change their profile pictures to images like this. So we're seeing things kind of filter through and permeate the world in a positive way. We're definitely seeing that there are affirming faith leaders, not just ones like Christina's family, who was very not affirming. folks like Denise and Matt here on this photo really spread trans and queer joy and are always there for folks and willing to have those conversations that are really difficult. And we know that people are building movements together, again, across different types of oppression, across different types of challenges, across different types of hate. So it's really positive to see that people are not operating in silos as we move through these tough times, but working together to try to stop what's going on. I wanted to share with you a little bit more about Christina's story before we wrap up today. So again, promised you that I would pull her back into this. We watched her TikTok video before, and I want to just share a little bit about her history. So Christina is a 44-year-old trans woman who was raised in that Christian religious household that caused a lot of damage for her. She currently has a TikTok channel, which is pretty darn cool and worth checking out. And on her channel, she talks a lot about what she calls dissing the Christo-fascists. And she discusses religious trauma and talks about the things that she plants and grows. She literally plants and grows things. So she was a performer, a femme entertainer. Some would call her a drag queen. Some would call her a female impersonator. Any of those words she relates to, but she was a performer at a very, very, very popular queer bar. And she made her own gowns and outfits like a lot of the other performers did. And she was quite the talk of the town when she was performing. And she was a really big draw for fundraisers and other things when she was performing actively. So all of the performers shared several dressing rooms at the club that she was working in behind the stage, typical of a lot of places. And she had really well-attended events, just like a lot of the other folks did in that club. And she also had experiences with some really troubling behaviors and some ethics related to the bar that she was working in. They had less than tight security about who could access those dressing rooms, who could get behind stage at this particular place. And so in 2016, she was sexually assaulted, as well as a couple of the other performers backstage in their dressing rooms. So several performers, several MCs, a bunch of people over the course of a week or so were assaulted. Some of what she learned later was that people had been experiencing assault for a really long time. It just hadn't happened to her. The bar refused to do anything about what was happening to her. They didn't make changes in security. They didn't change their staff who were part of the perpetrators. They didn't do anything, and she continued to perform for a little while after that. In June of 2016, the shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida happened, and she stopped performing a few weeks after that happened, and she hasn't stepped on a stage since 2016. Again, really popular, amazing performer, hasn't stepped on stage since the Pulse nightclub shooting. Since that time, since 2016, she has found love. So the photo on the screen is her and David, her now husband. They live on a large piece of land with a house, and she's been planting and growing things and trying to reintroduce natural plants into that community where she's living. She's been incredibly happy with her current partner, and they have just an amazing home life with lots of animals and chickens and lots of things that grow and live. And this year, she reached out to Forge and wanted to volunteer at this year's Milwaukee Pride Fest. This is one of the few things that we do in Milwaukee, and we're excited for her and her husband to volunteer. And we've talked several times since she asked about volunteering. And she's commented about how afraid and nervous she is. And she was like, well, damn it, I'm going to come anyway. And she said, damn it, I'm coming anyway, like a zillion times to me now. But she is like hell-bent on coming, no matter how scared she is, how nervous she is, how excited she is. And like I mentioned before, she sewed all of her gowns when she was performing, and she still likes to sew. So she ordered fabric, and she found a pattern, and she's creating a gown for Pride. I don't know how she's going to volunteer. This is what she made. What's on the screen is what she made. I do not want to think about what job we're going to give her to do for volunteering in that gown, but this is a gown that she says, I'm going to make pockets for it. I'm going to make a cape for it. It's going to be fantastic. And I'm going to be like the fairy trans mother. And I'm like, you go, sister, you go. So she's going to come, and she's been through all of these different pieces, and it's been 2016 to 2023, and she hasn't been out at queer events, and she's coming and she's making this gown where she really loves, and it's just a beautiful, to me at least, story of how long it can take to heal and what beauty can come out of it. So if she'll let us, and I think she will because she wants to strut her stuff, we will take pictures, and maybe we'll send you all a picture of her finalized gown and her smiling face in it. All right, a few resources, actually just one resource. So the one resource is the Equality Federation, and where you can keep up to date on current legislative actions. There could be a lot of other things that we could list as resources, but we didn't want to bog down a lot of things with places where you want or need to learn more about hate violence. We wanted to end with another poll, and we want to think about what you can do to uplift hope. So, oh, and you're already started. People already started. Excellent, people. Good job. So what can you do to uplift hope or make a positive change? Encourage others to do the right thing and be there for them through the aftermath, especially when isolation is a possible outcome. Educate and empower. Yeah. Legislative advocacy. Super. Try to exist and survive publicly. Yes. And that's really hard. What else can we do to uplift hope or make a positive change? Continue to share trans joy. Yeah. Be kind and speak up against hate. Yeah. Validate experiences and continue learning. Right on. Spread awareness about trans issues and encourage people to take a stand, especially cis white hetero people, to alleviate the burden off of victims. Yeah. Going to Pride in larger numbers. Yeah. Allow yourself to be educated. I like the wording of that. Great. Leave room for growth. Excellent. Look for tangible changes in your agency. Hold your friends and family accountable to transphobic rhetoric. Yep. Vote. Yes. If you can vote, please vote. Yeah. Other thoughts? Educate. Yeah. Lots of really good things. Excellent. Hope allies exist and hold them to that title. Yeah. Find strength in community. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much for offering so many ideas. I know that we're close to our time. So I'm going to share things that I've already shared with you. So if you were on other ones, you're going to see these same images again. And that's because I think they're important. And I think that they're really simple, and they're things that we want to continue to do. So Emil's going to share a quote with you first, and then we're going to do some simple things.
It is often easy for youth to feel like we do not belong, especially queer and trans kids of color. I deeply understand this loneliness, and I want to remind myself and others like me that just because we don't see ourselves in the media or in sports or in adults around us does not mean we don't exist or aren't valid. I've had to chart my own visibility and validity and prove that I exist despite everyone's doubts. And here I am. Trans and queer youth of color, you are here too. I see you, even if the mainstream media does not. You are valid.
Thank you. So that's Skylar Baylor, who was in that video with Dylan Mulvaney. So we could do some things like report hate speech. If we see it online, if we see it happening in our workplace, if we see it happening in our communities, we can do something by telling somebody if it's safe for us to do so. We can find and know who the affirming medical and mental health providers are. We can refer to them. We can choose to not refer to places that are not trans or queer affirming. We can listen. And sometimes that means just sitting and listening and not doing or trying to fix. We can make sure that our body language is open and warm and welcoming. And if people want or need to be hugged and feel consensually like that is an okay option, can we hug people? Can we put our hands together? What can we do to look at people and be with people in our physical way? and we can show up. We can show up with voting, we can show up at rallies, we can show up at Pride, we can show up at work and do our fantastic, wonderful jobs. We can write our senators, we can do all of those things, whatever is comfortable and safe for people to do. And a reminder for folks about, loving on your people. And I know that, again, that love is not always what people want to talk about. So fill in a different word, but how do we be kind to people? How do we show that compassion? How do we show that grace that Dylan Mulvaney was able to show to people? How do we extend that in different ways to the people that are around us, people that we care about, maybe some of the people that we are having a hard time with? What can we do with those folks? And I wanted to leave us with another quote, one from Chase Strangio.
There's resistance that is growing, and I believe in the power of our continued ability to find and celebrate ourselves and hold our communities in love.
Thank you. So most of you know how to connect with us, our website, our social media. I'm going to slip these by because Emil just put them in the chat. And we've got 2 minutes, 3 minutes for questions, which I know is not a lot. And where to find me. So if folks have questions, if folks have thoughts, I would love to hear them. And I want to thank y'all for being here before we run out of time. And I know today was really heavy. And as people are thinking or making any comments, I really encourage folks to take some time, if you can, if you're able to, when we close out today. And whether that is taking a sip of water or going for a short walk or a short roll, I encourage you to take a little bit of time for yourself because this was really, really intense today.
I want to just let folks know, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Emil, for today and for everything you offered the last few weeks. Folks might be aware that the Alliance is offering one more session, not with our wonderful Forged facilitators, but with myself and Amanda. It is coming up on Tuesday, June 13th from 1:30 to 3. So the same like time slot that we've been doing these trainings as sort of like a more processing debrief. What are we taking from these sessions? What are we doing maybe differently or doing more of, doing less of in our own agencies as a result of all the wonderful information that we got over the last few weeks. So I'll drop the registration link for that in the chat. It's also in the like our training calendar if you receive those via email. So Amanda and I will be there, and it's good. The time is going to be pretty open. Like we'll have some structure to it, but it's really going to be for folks to just debrief what we've been talking about the last month.
That sounds really excellent. You go. I want to thank Emil for doing the back end hard work again, and Kelsey and Amanda and Bridget, who's somewhere. Thank you for doing the ask and inviting us into your space for the last month. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.